Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review, Unscripted number 44 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I am an economist, military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or a one-time support on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. All right, so my apologies from the start. It seems like I am having issues with my soundboard or my headphones. Not sure what, but so if there's any issues, my apologies. It basically sounds like something has taken a dump, and I'm not sure what it is. So I apologize for any issues with the podcast. I can barely hear on my headphones, so all I'm doing is I'm looking at the chart, the meter to see where my voice is, and hopefully I'm not going too low or too high. So again, my apologies for any issues on the audio side. I will try to speak in a relatively flat tone, not to be too up or down, and not try to blow your ears out or where it sounds like a whisper. So my apologies in advance. So anybody new to the Substack, this weekly podcast, welcome. This is my normal week in review of the three main articles that I write on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays to just give some of my extemporaneous thoughts and notes and of the articles I wrote that's outside of what maybe I wrote during the article. I write a series of notes, put them in front of me, and then I just talk about the articles and see where we go from there. So truly just, it's not a script. It's not anything like that. Eventually, maybe I want to get something a little bit better, but that's what it is for today and the last 43 other podcasts prior to today. So the three articles this week were the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 26, Nuclear Warfare Policy, Cold War to Today, Part 7, and European Peacekeeping Discussion Picks Up Momentum. So we'll go to the West Philippine Sea Newsletter, Volume 26. In Volume 25 of the West Philippine Newsletter, I talked about the domestic turmoil in the Philippines between President Marcos and Vice President Duterte, which also brought in her father, the former president prior to the current president, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Rodrigo Duterte. There's a political crisis. There's impeachment documents or impeachment debate going on in the Philippine legislature, their Congress. Not sure where it's going to go, but the point that I was making is that there is still an external threat to Philippine sovereignty coming from the Chinese Communist Party, and that my point was on that article was that the Chinese were not involved in the creation of the internal political crisis in the Philippines, but they definitely were the beneficiaries of it. I still hold true to that today. My concern was as the Philippines become focused internally, they will not be able to focus on the external threats, or that was a concern. Well, the Philippine government has proved they can walk and chew gum at the same time. And they ran into a number of issues on the diplomatic stage challenging the Chinese claims of sovereignty in the South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea. For clarification, the West Philippine Sea is the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, internationally recognized exclusive economic zone of the Philippines in the South China Sea, and they've named it the West Philippine Sea. The Philippines is not an official designation outside of the Philippines, but it is to show their ownership of that area of the South China Sea, of which the South China Sea is based on the geographic markers of the South China Sea called the 9-dash line. The Chinese claim everything within the 9-dash line, which includes almost all of the Philippine internationally recognized exclusive economic zone. So there's ongoing discussions, and this was scheduled prior to the political debates inside the Philippines, internal political debates, is the Japanese Foreign Minister Takeshi Iwaya and Philippine Foreign Minister Enrique Manalo had set up meetings in Manila to discuss ongoing challenges of Chinese aggression in the West Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, and going all the way into the Yellow Sea and areas impacting Japanese islands, that disputed islands between Japan and China. So the Philippines and Japan do have a defense agreements. They cooperate extensively on defensive areas, including base sharing agreements and troop not troop transfers, but troop reciprocal agreements where they can both countries can use each other's military bases within ones that are designated. That still has to be approved in Japan. It's already been approved by the Philippines. Also, Japan is providing more advanced military equipment, not necessarily weaponry, but talk about radars and other detection equipment. Also producing more advanced ships for the Philippine Coast Guard, which is the primary instrument of the sovereignty claims between China and the Philippines. Most of that is carried on by the coast guards of each nation, with occasional military, especially with the Chinese recently, seeing more military hardware being introduced into the dispute. But the concern or the discussion between the two countries was obviously concerns over Chinese aggressive territorial claims, reaffirming their commitment to each other, discussing next steps. But in the background of this is the U.S. election, like so many other things in security arrangements all throughout the world of geopolitics, is call it, what is Trump going to do? The Trump effect. There was discussions about how the election would change the rules-based order within the South China Sea and West Philippine Sea, and agreements that the U.S., the Philippines, Japan have all signed both together in a trilateral agreement, but also they both have, Japan and Philippines, have defense alliances, bilateral defense alliances with each other, with the U.S. and Japan, the U.S. and the Philippines, not a trilateral defense alignment, but they do have trilateral agreements to meet Chinese aggression in the entire Western Pacific outside of the South China Sea. So those were ongoing discussions. It's something that's been concerned to both Japan and the Philippines, also in the background of the sovereignty claims over the Chinese sovereignty claims over the island of Taiwan. I call it the nation of Taiwan, but we'll call it the island nation of Taiwan. They call it a territory. The Chinese call it a territory, but that's background disputes. Now, Philippines do claim that they are neutral in any type of claims over Taiwan. Their concern is over sovereignty claims over the West Philippine Sea. So the discussions between it were, again, ongoing areas of cooperation between the Japanese and Philippines, but also discussions about what will change when the new administration took office this week. Now, the incoming National Security Advisor and now National Security Advisor Mike Waltz of the Trump administration said when it came to the formation of alliances in the West Philippine Sea, that both Jake Sullivan and Mike Waltz, Jake Sullivan is the prior National Security Council director, were in lockstep in their approach. Now, part of that is China has a tendency to challenge new administrations internationally to see how far they can push. Now, that's not official policy, but you find out within the first year of a new administration, China creates some type of crisis in the area, in the region, to see how far they can press. So part of it is the the statement by the National Security Director Mike Waltz was there's no separation between the two between the two administrations when it comes to security arrangements in the Western Pacific. Now, I think that is largely true. There is probably, I've talked about this in an earlier West Philippine Sea newsletter, there will probably be difference in contribution methodology, maybe some review of future payments or military support between the two nations. So there might, of course, there are going to be some differences between the two administrations. But that part of the discussions is what could the Japanese and Philippines consider changes in the relationship with the U.S. when it comes to what's going on in the West Philippine Sea. And they came basically to the conclusion is, first off, they called on the new administration to continue support and its engagement in the Western Pacific. But they also stated, especially from Philippine Foreign Minister Enrico Manalo, he said he did not expect any change in U.S. support of the Philippine position. Now, that was probably basically true. First off, I don't argue that with the statements from Mike Waltz and the position from we had the advantage with President Trump is he was president before, so you can get an idea of what his commitment is to the Western Pacific. He expects to have an aggressive foreign policy towards China, mainly in the economic sphere. So you do not expect that he will ease up in the Western Pacific. I think he will seek some form of common ground, but I agree with what Foreign Minister Enrique Manalo stated, is that there will probably be no basic changes to the American policies in regards to the Philippines. With Japan, it might be slightly different in very similar to what is seeing in NATO and the U.S. between the Trump administration and NATO is contribution rates. U.S. maintains a large number of troops, I think 50,000 troops in Japan. There's some ongoing discussions about this is across multiple administrations, is some of the discrepancy issues in U.S. basing in Okinawa between the U.S. government and the Japanese government. That will probably be ongoing discussions. There will probably be more requests for Japan to pay for more of its own security. But Japan has been moving in that direction. They've got a 5-year program. I think they're in their second or third year. They just passed their largest defense budget ever. And so I don't see that the issues that the Trump administration would have with Japan are going to be involving the military sphere, because Japan is showing commitments to beef up its armed forces. It has cooperation with the U.S. using a combination of purchasing U.S. weapons and producing domestically produced weapons. Again, biggest defense budget passed ever, and that's expected to increase over the next 2 years. There are challenges with the Japanese budget as far as their economy goes and what they can and can't afford. But right now, the Japanese are on a trajectory. Most of the disagreements between the Trump administration and the Japanese administration will be over economic issues, things like tariffs and trade agreements. So there's basically both countries have agreed, both the Philippines and Japan have asked for no changes in Western position, but based on the statements of Mike Waltz and the actions of the prior Trump administration and the aggressive stance that the U.S. is expected to take with China, it could be expected that the U.S. policy will basically stay the same, though there will probably be more focus on the bilateral relationships than these trilateral agreements that were formed under the prior administration. But you're not going to see very much change in that regards. Right now, foreign aid is halted, but that does not state anything about military aid. And there are expected to be some future grants given to the Philippines under the prior administration. Those will obviously be up for review. That's involving the Philippines and upgrading the facilities. But my thing is, my view is that once those are up, the review process goes, those will most likely go forward in the Philippines. So even Enrique Manalo, the foreign minister, stated that he did not see any significant changes in U.S. policy regarding the Philippines or Japan. Now, the Japanese foreign minister, Iwaya, excuse me if I mispronounced that, my apologies, is he attended the inauguration in Washington, D.C. of President Trump, and the U.S. new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was sworn in shortly thereafter. It was expected that the foreign minister would take time to build contacts with the new administration to try to push the Japanese case. Obviously, there's also some discussions about purchase of U.S. steel and the opposition from the new administration over Japanese purchase of U.S. steel. That would obviously be a talking point, but it is expected that the Japanese foreign ministry would try to, after its meeting with the Philippines, it would try to push its case with Washington and the new administration about the need of continued U.S. engagement. Again, stating it doesn't look like the U.S. is really going to make any significant changes to its agreements within the West Philippine Sea. So obviously, with the internal discussions that are going on in Washington and in Tokyo and Manila, it looks like, again, there's going to be no changes. But I guess I lost my thought here. Even with the internal focus in the Philippines, obviously they are still thinking about what's going on regarding their we'll call it a contest with China, the contest of wills. It's certainly not a shooting war, but it's a sovereignty claims issue. The Philippines are definitely still focusing on what needs to be done to address the Chinese stance, and they're looking at what the new administration and addressing that. Also, Foreign Minister Manalo also attended the ASEAN meeting, which is the Asian. Oh gosh, I can't remember it, but anyway, he attended the Asian meeting in Malaysia, which is a pact of Asian nations in the Pacific. They have. It does not include China, does not include the U.S., does not include Australia. But they are, it's bugging me. I got to look up what ASEAN. I call it ASEAN just to keep myself honest on it. ASEAN, the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations, it's 10 states in the Pacific region, and it consists of Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, which is in the middle of a civil war, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. Brunei, Vietnam, Philippines, and let's see, Brunei, the Philippines, Vietnam all have issues with, and Malaysia all have sovereignty claim issues in the South China Sea over the Chinese claims, sovereignty claims. So, Foreign Minister Manalo attended the Asian meeting in Malaysia. Focus was the continued civil war in Myanmar, but also the need for the Asian nations to agree to become more aggressive in the communications or negotiations with what's called the Code of Conduct for the South China Sea, which is between the Asian bloc and China. Now, this issue that's the Asian meeting, I think almost 2 years ago, they said that the agreement was to really get this agreement, this code of conduct, hammered out between China and Asia by the end of 2025. The late last year, President Marcos attended the Asian leaders meeting. I think it was called the East Asian Summit as well. I think that's what it was called. It was basically they had the two meetings were held together, or in the same location, same state, so more countries could attend. It was a week-long event. I think it was in Laos, and one of the discussion topics was the code of conduct in the South China Sea, and President Marcos vented his frustration with the lack of progress in creating this code of conduct in the South China Sea. Now, Foreign Minister Manalo also came in, and he basically reinforced the president's message that, hey, this needs to be negotiated. It's this agreement. They said, hey, you got 2 years to get this negotiated by the end of 2025 based on the previous Asian leaders meeting. This code of conduct, this discussion has been going on since 2002. Now, the issue in the South China Sea has escalated in the last few years. So this nonchalant discussions of trying to get this code of conduct created between Asia and China has been ongoing, but it's definitely taken on a measure of urgency as the clashes between the Philippines and China, and to a lesser extent Vietnam and China, have increased. So President Marcos said late last year, he was talking about that the lack of progress in these negotiations was unacceptable. Foreign Minister Manalo, when he attended the meeting in Malaysia, he stated the same thing, and that the negotiations it was time for them to get into the meat of the issue. Basically meaning is that Asia and China have not really got into the major issues of what needs to be discussed and what needs to be agreed upon as they go to these minor peripheral issues, and have, in what the Philippines' point of view is, Asia and China are actively avoiding getting into the hard parts of the discussion. Now, part of the challenge with Asia is that there are some of its members, of the 10 members, 3 of them have sovereignty disputes with China, but other ones take a more nuanced approach and a less confrontational approach with China, and they don't necessarily have sovereignty claim issues in the South China Sea like the Philippines, Vietnam, and Brunei do, and Malaysia to a lesser extent. So they also, again, you have different views, just what you see in NATO, where you have some countries have a less hawkish view towards Russia, and others are very hawkish. You're seeing that at the same time that Asian disagreements in Asia. Indonesia tends to be much more favorable to the Chinese position. It's certainly less confrontational than what you see in the Philippines, Vietnam. Brunei tends to be also, even though it has sovereignty claims, it tends to also be relatively confrontational with the Chinese. So that kind of handcuffs Asia, because they're not speaking as a unified bloc. And so if they want, the Philippines and lesser extent Vietnam want a more aggressive approach to these negotiations to create a code of conduct in South China Sea, other members of Asia are not so much. So that kind of hamstrings Asia in trying to get this agreement settled. But the other issue that Asia is running into is that China has a very strict policy that they follow, is that they want all disagreements, territorial, economic, whatever disagreements, to be handled on a bilateral basis and not bring in third parties, or certainly not a bloc like Asia. The reason why they do this is that in the Western Pacific, obviously China is the biggest economy in the region, the biggest military in the region. Obviously, they've got some challenges from Japan, who also has a large economy, not as large as China, but it also has an effective military, not as effective or not as large as China's either. The U.S. obviously operates in bases in the Western Pacific through joint basis agreements with the Philippines. Not a huge presence, not like they had when they were in Subic Bay and Clark Air Base, but they obviously have a somewhat of a presence there. You got presence in Guam, Okinawa, mainland of Japan, South Korea. So the U.S. has a presence in the region, but obviously the big power, it's in China's backyard, the Western Pacific. They are by far the biggest power in the region. That's, again, not to sit there and dismiss that U.S. has a strong presence in that area that challenge the Chinese. But as far as Western Pacific nations, China is a Western Pacific nation. The U.S. is not. So the advantage of the Chinese in these negotiations, or wanting bilateral negotiations, is basically they hold all the cards. They have the biggest military. They have the biggest economy. Any country that goes into a bilateral discussion with the Chinese outside of the United States, and maybe a lesser extent Japan, is going to be on their back foot with China. China holds all the power, the biggest military, the biggest economy. Any bilateral negotiation, China is going to be able to leverage its economic and military strength to its advantage to get a negotiation out in its favor. And many countries in the region understand that and choose a non-confrontational view with China because they do not want to face China's wrath, knowing that they are completely at a disadvantage when they negotiate with China. So this is all, China holds all the cards by insisting on bilateral agreements. So if I was China, I would do the same thing. You get all the benefits of negotiation because all the cards are in your hands. And China has no issues using the carrot stick approach of it with its economic aid. The U.S. does much of the same thing, but China is also not afraid to leverage its military to its advantage, much like the U.S. So China acts very much like a superpower. So again, bilateral agreements or negotiations are the way that China chooses to go. So ASEAN, representing 10 countries, is trying to negotiate this code of conduct of South China Sea. It is completely contrary to China's policy of bilateral negotiations because now they're negotiating with a bloc of 10 countries, 3 of which they have sovereignty claim disputes with. China has no interest in negotiating in earnest in these discussions with ASEAN. So they will talk about these, they will discuss with the periphery issues, the minor issues, but the meat of the issue, which Secretary or Foreign Minister Manalo wants to have hammered out and that they needed to be faced, ASEAN has no real interest because you have what I just stated earlier, is there's no unified agreement in the approach to China, and the Chinese have no interest in actually taking on serious negotiations outside of the bilateral arrangements that it prefers. So ASEAN, even though they do not have they definitely want, they do have a unified approach that they want to find a way to have to de-escalate tensions in the South China Sea. That seems uniform in Asian nations. It's just the approach is different about how aggressive to take these negotiations. So it just really appears that there's no real, outside of wanting a peace in the region and try to de-escalate tensions, which is an agreement with ASEAN, it's an agreement with China. The approach, because China is very steadfast that they claim all of the South China Sea is their own, and they will not budge off that, just like they do with the Taiwan question being an internal affairs matter. They will not budge off that. And ASEAN is not willing, because they don't speak as a unified bloc, they will not negotiate. They will not leverage any of their advantages to upset China. So it looked like something 2 years ago or almost 2 years ago when they talked about actually getting in there and negotiating this code of conduct for the South China Sea. It really looks like in the end there's no real hope of getting this negotiated. Which again, now that falls onto the disruption between the Philippines and the West Philippine Sea and Japan as well. It's pretty much going to fall on the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines to hammer out some type of arrangement with China to de-escalate tensions. And I don't know if it's really there. China has to be really induced to come to the bargaining table in earnest, and it doesn't seem like they view that their approach to it is nothing is negotiable. When China believes that it's in their interest, there's no negotiation. Now, not that doesn't mean they're seeking conflict, but they're not seeking resolution either. They definitely don't have any nuanced approach to their claims. And it's worked for them because for the most part, most of the world is non-confrontational towards China. And the Philippines have started making an exception to that rule. Not saying they want to get a shooting war with China, but they definitely don't seem to be backing down either. So it's been somewhat of a challenge for China. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like the Asian nations, they've accepted that they want to do this code of conduct, but it doesn't look like this is really going anywhere. It's probably time for call it invested parties in the regions to seek another way forward to try to handle the tensions in the South China Sea. And again, I'm going to state the U.S. has not given any indication it will reassess its engagement in the Western Pacific in either scale or in policy. There will be, again, talk about negotiations over trade, maybe reciprocal payments agreements, paying your own way. I don't see that being an issue with any of these countries as it wasn't during the first Trump administration. So I don't see any changes in this area. It's an unfortunate area. I will say that the press overblew the talks in the Manila between the Japanese and the Philippine foreign minister, where they talked about the press blew it up is those two countries are pleading for that the U.S. don't pull out of the region. But but then when you talk to each one of the foreign ministers independently, when you read the discussions with each foreign minister, they both agreed that that wasn't going to happen. So again, the blow up was the concern that the two foreign ministers met to try to keep plead for U.S. engagement or continued U.S. engagement in the region. Neither one of them, meaning neither foreign minister, when talking to the press, agreed that that was even an issue. So, or it wasn't really a concern that the U.S. was going to pull out of the region. And I think they're correct in their assessment, and I tend to think that many of what was said was basically overblown by the media, which is something you see in both Europe and the U.S. and in Asia. It's the same thing. It's called clickbait, fear mongering, and it was cooler heads have obviously thought this through more thoroughly than what the press has done. Again, trying to grab big headlines to get people to read their articles, and when you get into the meat of what's being said, you realize that it's not really a major concern in either Tokyo or Manila or Washington. All right, so that's what I have to say about that. Even with all the internal political issues in the Philippines, they are continuing to focus on the diplomatic channels to foreign policy and diplomatic channels to settle issues in the West Philippine Sea, which look like they're still in a hard point because the Asian bloc is really probably not going to be able to negotiate a code of conduct that is anywhere near what the Philippines and Vietnam want to see. All right, so the next one is Nuclear Warfare Policy, Cold War Today, Part 7. This is a two-part paper this week about the part one. It's kind of confusing that I have the part 7. I've written 7 articles involving the nuclear warfare policy. Then each one tends to have a sub part area. So this one's about the difference between counterforce and counter value strategies, and focusing on counterforce in the first doctrine. So the next week, or this week coming up, no, I'm saying this is going to be released on Saturday. So next week there will be a part 2 of 2 finishing this discussion about different nuclear doctrines. I look at it from the point of view, the terminology used is what is used in the United States, but they have different terms, obviously, in the Soviet Union and Russia. But basically, they've as they develop their own limited nuclear war strategies, they've adopted similar thoughts along the U.S. lines. They may just call it something different, but it's basically the same type of doctrine and how they approach their doctrine. So, talk about first off is the evolution and challenges of U.S. strategic nuclear doctrine, not theater level nuclear doctrine, strategic nuclear doctrine. So the U.S. strategic nuclear doctrine has obviously evolved since the advent of nuclear weapons age in 1945, when the first bomb was exploded in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and all the discussions at that point, do we use the bomb in Japan or do we not? And that was the advent of the strategic nuclear doctrine. It really took hold after the Soviet Union exploded its first nuclear bomb in 1949, ending the U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons. So it went through, I won't go through all the phases, but that's basically when strategic nuclear doctrine was created. So it's gone through a series of phases, and then starting in the 60s, probably largely after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, is the U.S. doctrine started evolving away from the ideas of mutual assured destruction or massive retaliation, those types of nuclear doctrines. So it became into something that was a little more, something more than I go back to Gwen Dyer. Basically, the U.S. and the Soviet Union wanted to have other options with their strategic nuclear weapons, which they had invested heavily in. They wanted other options instead of just blowing up the world in one shot in what was called, I can't remember the person who said, the official that said that, is basically a nuclear spasm, where everybody fires off their own weapons, destroy the world, and the world ends. And basically that was eventually it was called assured destruction, later called mutual assured destruction, MAD, looking for that description about the madness of nuclear weapons. So after the early 60s, it started evolving into creating new categorizations of limited nuclear war to give other options outside of this nuclear spasm or this assured destruction. Now, I can talk about areas of nuclear equivalency, assured destruction, mutual assured destruction, is even when they started creating limited nuclear war doctrines, the trump card, or not being President Trump, but the trump card in it was the idea that the ultimate nuclear response was, even in a limited nuclear situation, they could always go out and just do what the original founding of mutual assured destruction is: go out and destroy the cities of each other's countries and basically just destroy each other in a nuclear firestorm. That was always left in the version, but the idea is that they weren't going to go up to it immediately, or they want, at least as a doctrine, they wanted to have the option of determining whether they wanted to go directly to full-out nuclear exchange, or did they want to escalate using nuclear weapons to for limited objectives to try to de-escalate the war from extending any further. Now, This meant that they had to start categorizing is instead of just going out there and mutually assured destruction, firing off all your nuclear missiles at the country's cities and their and the associated manufacturing base, economic base of the country, which was usually limited in cities, is they looked for other objectives outside of that. Obviously, if you destroy a country's population, you don't have a country. So that was the ultimate deterrence: is we can destroy you, but then they can turn around and destroy us, meaning the U.S. So the doctrine they created, or the what they called adding to the strategic objectives, was something called counter value, and that's the cities and the manufacturing base of a country. Basically, the things that make a country, its people and its manufacturing base, the things that make that it produces, the wealth it creates for both itself and the world. That's the counter value. If you don't have counter value, you don't have a country. And again, that was the ultimate objective of mutual assured destruction. Destroy those counter value targets, because if you take away the population, you take away a country. And it went both ways, and there's no defense against that because there wasn't such thing as anti-ballistic missile. I talked about in part 6 and part 5 about the role of civil defense in a way to try to minimize the impact of counter value targeting. But the other factor was called counter force doctrine. And that was focusing on the objectives of the country, the things that the country could use to maintain its military control or its nuclear weapons, its strategic nuclear weapons, both in silos, submarine support, bomber bases, weapon storage. And that was basically called the counter force targets. And then Jimmy Carter in 1980 added a new strategy called countervailing. Now, countervailing is the things that are held most importantly to the Soviet leadership, the things that make command possible. That'd be command and control centers, critical industries, maybe military headquarters, political targets, including political leaders themselves. That was the idea of countervailing, was a way to start taking away things in the Soviet society, Soviet leadership that would make them, if they lose these, they lose control of their country, short of destroying the population. Countervailing, largely in many of the doctrines that I read, is they turn countervailing into a subset of counterforce doctrine. Now, the idea is with the counterforce is it serves several objectives that you can start focusing on. For example, you can start targeting Soviet nuclear ICBMs, destroy those ICBMs, and start negating those threats that they held to U.S. cities. Basically, try to declaw the Soviet nuclear threat to the cities. Again, you destroy the cities, you destroy the country. Again, when I talk about cities, I'm talking about also the economic value within those cities, which includes manufacturing data, the manufacturing base, and the ability to be able to control your country. So the idea was that counter value starts trying to take away those targets that are held important to that could threaten the U.S. cities, and vice versa, because the Soviets were also showing the same version of this when they came up with land-based missiles, and then they also came up with mobile missiles, things that could do a second strike, where they could launch a first strike against U.S. ICBMs and bomber bases, but they withhold maybe their mobile missiles, so ICBMs, from U.S. counterstrikes to be able to hold U.S. cities as hostages to Soviet demands. U.S. on the other side would have their invulnerable nuclear submarines. The Soviets also had submarines, but the U.S. submarine force was more significant. But the Soviets also had a mobile ICBM force that the U.S. did not have. They tried to create that with the Peacekeeper, also known as the MX missile, but that never came to be. It just got put into old Minuteman silos. So the idea is that these counter value was to start the counter force attacks were to start taking away attack the Soviet assets, nuclear assets, to the things that would be used to attack ultimately the counter value targets. Start trying to take away all those objectives from each other in the hope that they could reach an agreement to end the war before the cities are held hostage. So it was the idea of trying to limit the objectives of what you can attack. Or I guess you create more targets. And the idea is to try to defang the other side's strategic nuclear weapons to keep the cities safe. Basically, take away the counter value threat. Now, how did this work? Is you go in there and you say, obviously, you focus on ICBM. So what do you do to, and this is what happened during the Cold War, is if you start targeting ICBMs, okay, you need more missiles. Like the country that's thinking about attacking the ICBMs to create these counter force attacks. Okay, so you attack the ICBMs. What's the defense? Build more ICBMs, make them mobile. Now, remember, during the period that most of this was created, until 1990, the nuclear submarine force, their weapons, their strategic launch ballistic missiles, until the Trident II, D5 missile came around, is the SLBMs were not accurate enough to attack missile silos and bomber bases. They were basically there to attack cities. So when you go through this whole doctrine is you start creating more and more weapons. So ICBM and bombers were the primary weapons that were available that could do this type of counter force targeting. They were accurate enough to do it. So if your target in a counter value is to attack the other side's ICBMs, the way to defend against that is either create mobile missiles, the MX missile. The Soviets were also very good, and the Russians today, of creating mobile launchers. You look at the map of Russia, it's huge. Well, the U.S. is not small either, but the U.S. never adopted a effective mobile ICBM system, not like the Russians did, and the Soviets before that. So the defense against that is to create more missiles, create more bomber bases, diversify your force. When you do that, that means you need to make more weapons to attack the other side's more weapons. So you get this vicious circle going on. The other part, when you add in the idea of countervailing and also subsets of of counter force, you start looking at weapons storage facilities. So the idea is, okay, I got to attack these nuclear weapons storage facilities, because what happens is that the Soviets, with their mobile launchers, can reload these mobile carriers with new weapons, so with new ICBMs, and continue to launch ICBM. So you got to destroy the weapons storage facility. So how do you counter that? Well, you make more rockets and more nuclear warheads, and you start diversifying them out, creating more targets. So it comes into this never-ending structure. So what's like, okay, when you go into countervailing, it said, well, we got to destroy the command and control and intelligence centers, because you want to make sure that the Soviet leadership and the U.S. leadership cannot communicate with each other. And then you also have to go in there and create more robust command and control centers that can be able to survive, either through diversifying to your local commanders, the use of nuclear weapons once presidential authorization has occurred, or if there's a decapitation strike, that there's some ability for local commanders to act out with nuclear weapons in the pre-assigned, pre-planned targeting doctrine. And then you go so you start attacking those assets. And then also when you're talking about second waves of like a second or third ICBM launch, because you've been able to, in the Soviet case, you've been able to reload those launchers. The U.S. case is their bomber force can be able to fly back in, reload, fly back out, launch the nuclear attack, and what survived the first waves, and what bomber bases survived as well. So you have this continuing wave. So you've got to also have an intelligence collection to be able to say, hey, we got to strike these second targets. So what happens is you get into this counter force doctrine. The idea is that your targets become more and more and more and more. You got to maybe you have to reattack the intelligence observation. So you have to find ways to start attacking more and more targets. So the list of targets start growing, growing, and growing. So at some point, the ability, the targets start going past the ability of the number of weapons that are available. So roughly in the doctrine coming back from McNamara, and I'll talk about this in the second article, talking about what the objectives of counter value targeting was and what was considered needed for a successful counter value, which was, again, the ultimate deterrence, is they only needed about the ability of having about 2,000 weapons to be able to destroy all the Soviet cities, roughly the same from the Soviet perspective. So if you're able to do that, then if the minimal deterrence force sits right around that, call it that 2,000 weapons area, and you notice after the START Treaty, what are the doctrines sitting around? This was after the Cold War, this Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, reduced the number of weapons from about 25,000 per Soviet Union and United States. Soviet Union, Russia basically took on the agreements of the Soviet Union, that took them down just below 2,000 warheads. But what the idea was, they thought that to have an efficient counter value, an effective deterrence of a counter value assault, they needed about 2,000 weapons. But they had 25,000, and the list was growing. So the idea is that the writers of this from the Brookings Institute made the argument that the counter force doctrine actually made the world more unsafe, and that if the ultimate ability is if the ultimate trump card of deterrence is counter value, then why do you need 25,000 warheads and not just 2,000? And Jimmy Carter asked that question as well. And I'm not talking about President Carter as great or good or bad. He ultimately created the countervailing strategy and the idea of talking about a winnable nuclear war. So just because he asked the question and people think he was a peacenik, he also pushed the nuclear war doctrine to an area that had never been seen before, and was basically, for the most part, was the backbone of the Reagan administration nuclear war doctrine, which was considered very aggressive, but basically the backbone of it was the Carter administration's doctrine. So the idea is that counter value just created more and more and more targets, and it just turned around and created this more and more spending, more and more defense established, gave more credence to the idea to the commanders of the strategic nuclear forces. And the idea is you go back into the idea of nuclear equivalency, which was created based on counter value or assured destruction doctrine, is that both sides had to have roughly an equal number of warheads. Well, when you added counter value into the mix, the number of targets become greater and greater and greater, but both sides were committed to this idea of nuclear equivalency, because if the other side has more weapons, they could create what was viewed as more thorough destruction on the other side's society. So you had to keep a relative parity in nuclear weapons. So if your idea is that all you're going to do is just blow up the cities, well, you could sit around 2,000 weapons, which again is basically what the START Treaty has agreed to. Basically, the idea is takes out most of the counter value targeting, but counter value has not left the U.S. or the Russian doctrine. And it tends to make the idea is that both sides are seeking more and more targets to be able to attack for the other side, even in today's world. So it just goes in the idea is that when they introduced the idea of counter value, which against, counterforce and countervailing, which made the idea of a limited nuclear war possible. But the background idea was ultimately, no matter what happened to the counterforce, the idea is that you had to withhold enough nuclear force and be able to preserve that nuclear force to be able to destroy the cities. And if it gets to the point with counter force targets and they start destroying enough of the other side's nuclear weapons, once they get into this reserve buffer of, call it 2,000 weapons, they're going to have to go ahead and make that decision to attack each other's cities. Not saying they would go that way, but that's where that critical factor of what has to be done in nuclear doctrine. Now, I could be wrong on this, but just looking at the numbers, looking at what the statements coming from prior Secretary of States and call it thought leaders when it came to nuclear warfare doctrine, that seemed to be the case. Is you can attack all these points up to that 2,000 weapons orientation, and then at some point a decision had to be made. Do you attack the cities or do you try to negotiate a settlement? The idea was that cooler heads would prevail and they would negotiate a settlement before they cut into that decision at what they had to attack the targets. Now, also I go back to that 2000 force structure is when you go start reading in parts 5 and 6 of the series, when I start talking about nuclear or the role of civil defense, 2,000 weapons was considered the primary number of weapons needed for an effective destruction of the other side's cities, the things that make their society run, the ultimate counter value of assault. So that's kind of where I go into that 2,000 range as well. So that is something that the idea of counter value is when they added to the counter value doctrine, which again was the assured destruction, that was tied into nuclear equivalency, when they added the idea of counter force and later countervailing, with that doctrine of nuclear equivalency still in place based on mutual or assured destruction, it just created this arms race that more and more targets were created. And that as you created these you created the more and more targets to create, it incentivized more weapons, but you're tied into nuclear equivalency, so you did buy more weapons. I'm repeating myself at this point. So that's just some of the issues that come up with the counterforce document. And even today, the counter force doctrine is still in effect, even though both sides are limited to roughly 2,000 weapons. Though this week it was announced, I think just prior to the Biden administration leaving office, is that they believe the Russians, even though they have withdrawn from the START treaty or suspended, I don't think they said they withdraw, they had stayed under the limits of the START treaty as far as nuclear weapons that were operational. It is believed last week that they actually crossed the threshold of the nuclear treaty. So I'm not sure what that means. It's not sure if that's a permanent move or if it was bringing on new weapons online and then going to move other weapons to storage. It's unsure, but it is believed that Russia crossed the cap of START treaty last week. So the other part that goes into counter value is that as the U.S. develops more and more weapons, they are looking at the doctrine of counter force attacks, mainly towards command and control and political targets, is they have searched more and more at looking at non-nuclear options to support a counter force type strike. Not necessarily attacking ICBM sites or SLBM sites, or the docks where strategic launch ballistic missile submarines live, where they're based out of when they're not at sea, bomber bases as well, is the U.S. is looking at ways to use conventional arms to be able to disrupt and destroy those targets that are called countervailing targets is start including those as conventional targets and not nuclear, not to use nuclear targets. Now that means that there is no limitation on the use of conventional weapons. There's no cap on the number of weapons. So much of the U.S. counterforce document, not all of it, but a good portion of counterforce could be moved to conventional arms, which are outside of treaty limits. So you can, what was a nuclear target, counterforce nuclear target in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, can also, it might be in the possibility that those are now conventional targets, and you don't need to commit nuclear weapons to do your countervailing assaults on intelligence collections, command and control, and political targets. The Soviets or the Russians have less of the ability to do that. Obviously, you look at the U.S. Production of deep burrowing bunker buster weapons. That is part of the weapons that can be used to attack countervailing and counterforce targets that, again, were once in the past nuclear or used. Nuclear weapons were used as the primary method of attacking those. So the U.S. has opened the possibility of creating a conventional option to supplement their nuclear doctrine. Also going into it is the hypersonic weapons. Could those eventually use their speed and mass to be able to also be used effectively to attack each other's counterforce assets that nuclear weapons were once used against? So that's the possibility as new, modern, and more effective conventional weapons. They could become developed. They could be used to attack nuclear targets or things tied into nuclear targeting. All right, so join next week. Come looking forward next week to talk about the part 2 of that, which will be mainly discussing the ideas of counter value targeting and the future of potential future of U.S. nuclear strategy. Now, this was created primarily from the Brookings Institution, a paper that they wrote in 1999. Interesting points. I think it's not using any of the source documents like I've used in some of the other ones. So it's a combination of their evaluation and my evaluation of their points on some of the source documents that I've read, coming mainly from presidential libraries and such. So join in next week for the conclusion of that paper. So final paper is European peacekeeping discussion picks up momentum. Much like what was discussed in the West Philippine Sea newsletter, volume 26 that we just discussed here, is, excuse me while I take a drink of water. I talk too much. So, all right. So much like what's happened in the West Philippine Sea newsletter, what you're seeing in Europe is a paradigm shift. There is much of it overblown in the media is that the all the things that the new Trump administration is going to do is that they're going to pull out of NATO, they're going to pull out of the Western Pacific. It's a lot of overblown clickbait. It's a lot of reading into the fears, and this is not coming from the U.S. mainstream media. This is coming from European and Asian sources as well, and of course, a lot of the conglomerates news media in the U.S. is also operates internationally. You can look at Reuters, AP, Associated Press, places like CNN International. So it does bleed into maybe U.S. political discussions, bleed into the mainstream media, and it feeds into many of the fears of statements that are said by President Trump, and then they get blown up into almost acting out as policy when a lot of it is You could say that some of it's an artful messaging by the new president and, again, the prior president, 45 and 47th president of the United States. So some of it's stylistic, but it also it has often been used to feed into the worst fears of the Europeans. But there's been something interesting in that it has created a paradigm shift in what is possible in the Ukraine war. Under the prior administration, the Europe and the United States got involved into the Ukraine war. I would say through initially we'll just say that their actions were in the right place, trying to allow the Ukrainians to effectively fight back. I don't think the Russians, and I don't think the U.S. for the most part, especially after you talk about the fall in Afghanistan and how quickly that government with all the U.S. aid folded like an origami in a windstorm, is that the Ukrainians, especially, again, they have what happened in 2014, where the Ukrainians were basically put up no resistance to to the Russian seizure of Crimea and the destabilization of the Donbass. So the idea was that the West was, okay, they're going to try to support Ukraine in this initial war, which I think most of them expected it would be a short war. And lo and behold, the Ukrainians had proven themselves tougher with less defensive aid than what was ever given to the, what was given to the Ukrainians was only a small percentage of what was given to the Afghanis, and the Ukrainians stood up to the Russian army. Now, of course, they've lost a lot of people in the process at the time, but they did not cave like most observers expected Ukraine would cave within a month. And when they didn't, the West was to the point thinking that could they cast a defeat to the Russian army? Could they, could they find a way to fight the Russian army to a standstill, create an embarrassment for Putin? Because again, especially, especially in the West, where they created the Russian boogeyman, that they were responsible for bringing President Trump into power when he was elected in 2016. Somebody had to be blamed, and it was the Russians, and a whole series of fallouts of diplomatic efforts completely eliminated Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's Russian reset was completely thrown out after her defeat to President Trump, where somebody had to be blamed. And there was an effort to basically, written about this many times, about the diplomatic isolation of Russia. So the U.S. West basically got themselves into a war in Russia, and Russia got themselves, and again, ultimately Russia made this decision to cross the border. So this is ultimately their blunder, but the West also went on along the road, and they went down a path where there was nothing but escalation available to either side. And the Ukrainians were in the middle. They're holding this point, but Western aid increases despite Russian red flags. Russia can't directly, they did not want to directly attack the West, so they find oblique ways to attack the West, destabilize the region. Look what happened on the Korean Peninsula. Look what happened in the hybrid warfare attacks, mainly up in the areas to the northern part of NATO, the Baltic region. You're seeing today. As the West crossed red lines, Russia doesn't directly respond to those red lines, but they find oblique ways to disrupt the West and to create more and more tensions in the world, just by blowing up agreements that were agreed upon in the past. Well, now the idea that President Trump has taken office, he ran on finding a way to end the Ukraine war. He said that he could do it in a day. Again, that wasn't possible. but he has made a commitment to ending the war. He's also made a point that Europe, NATO specifically, needs to spend more money on its own defense. If it's wanting to, many parts of they've increased defense spending to the 2% goal, GDP goal, which most were not doing prior to the Ukraine war, but they passed it in 2014 after the Russian invasion of Crimea, and a vast majority, I think only 3 countries for the longest period, only reached that 2% target until it was pushed really towards the last year of the Biden administration, where roughly 2/3 of NATO agreed that 100% of the countries in NATO agreed to spend 2%. Now, a lot of that 2% spending is not going to create new weapons in Europe or create the additional capability, create more munitions that are often needed to fight a war. It's one thing, you create these whiz-bang weapons and all that good stuff, but if you don't make enough of them and you don't make enough munitions to support it and the ability to move it to whatever front line you have, you're basically ineffective. So you need to spend more money. Well, a lot of that, when those 2/3 of 3/4 of NATO reach the defense spending target of 2%, much of that money is used to go to Ukraine. Now, U.S. also sends aid to Ukraine, military aid. U.S. is the biggest provider of military aid to Ukraine. Germany and Europe is the second most. Germany provides the most overall aid to Ukraine. That includes, Germany provides the most aid in Europe to Ukraine. And Europe as a whole provides more economic aid to Ukraine. The idea is that the war has displaced the Ukrainian economy. The idea is that the West provides more support, economic support to Ukraine to keep stabilization in their society, which is needed to fight the war. So President Trump has stated that NATO needs to spend more than 2%, and he's made we'll call it a stretch goal of 5%, which many laughed at because some countries are really struggling at 2%. The idea of a 5% goal was, his point was that you reach 2% because you're sending a lot of military aid to Ukraine, but you're not replenishing your own stocks. You're not increasing your own capabilities. A lot of that 2% is basically replacing what you're sending to Ukraine. U.S. to a lesser extent, but again, U.S. has a much bigger defense budget than any of the European countries, both in GDP and overall spend. So the point was that to reach that 2% GDP goal was based in peacetime. They reached this 2% GDP goal while sending all this military aid to Ukraine. They need to go over and above the 2% cap to start making what was originally meant to happen under the 2% GDP target goal. So the point is, it's kind of an artificial when they sit there and say, "Oh, look at us, NATO. We're almost 75% of the GDP goal that we 100% agreed upon. Yay, us." That was during peacetime. That was not while massive amounts of aid are being moved to support a war in Ukraine. So President Trump has stated that to start keeping up, to be able to replenish your stocks, that was meant in a 2% GDP environment in peacetime, it needs to move up to to around 5% to meet all the objectives of the 2% peacetime goal, while a war is being supported by Europe in Ukraine. So they have to go over and above those caps. And I've written about that before. He just had the ability with his bully pulpit to make it a point. The overall laughed at by many NATO leaders, but countries in the Baltics were relatively agree. I think you got positive agreements from Poland. Not sure if they think they can get there. I think Estonia has already said they will go to a 5% defense or agreement. And Germany wants to, they have elections coming up. They're talking about trying to get 3%. That's a big stretch for Germany. But they are going to attempt to do that. France as well France has kind of scoffed at the idea of the 5% goal. But now, going back to the original message, is French President Macron, he started back in 2023 being much more vocal and aggressive towards Russia and the war in Ukraine. He has also been a vocal critic of Europeans' lack of defense spending. And France has not been the worst, but they have not exactly been the best either in defense spending. But they did not have a crash demobilization that you saw in Germany and Italy. It was a much more measured downgrade in the size of the French military, but they still maintain an industrial base to keep up with the needs of their reduced size military. Well, President Macron has argued that Europeans need to invest more in their defense. Now, he's looking at it from the point of view is that he wants he's offered to provide French nuclear forces to be available to the European Union. He is railed against the idea that the most powerful military force that Europe accepts this, is the most powerful force in Europe militarily is the United States, which is a non-European country. And this is something that has irked President Macron. And you also got President Trump, both on the campaign trail and now today, and even when he was his first term, was he wanted the Europeans to pay more for their own defense and not rely on the U.S. So President Macron and President Trump, and you can remember from the first term, these two did not see eye to eye on many things. Now, they weren't, say, mortal enemies, but it was a lot of disagreements. But now you're finding that President Macron's pushing for the idea of a more concerted area of European defense where Europe is responsible for European defense. You got President Trump coming in that's saying that the Europeans need to take more responsibility for their own defense. So now you see that President Macron of France and President Trump of the United States are aligned in the idea of European defense, that Europeans take the lead on European defense. So this kind of matches with the discussion. So when the Notre Dame Cathedral was reopened in November after the U.S. election, President Macron invited President-elect Trump to meet with him and to meet with President Zelensky at the French presidential palace. So the discussions were made that they were starting to reach an agreement, and then President Macron later flew to Warsaw in early December to discuss what was discussed between Ukraine president and him and President-elect Trump. And so at a speech this week, Macron called it an opportunity, or as quote, opportunity for a European strategic wake-up call. And the aim is he wants to embrace President Trump's desire for Europeans to take a greater burden for their own defense, which again aligns with what President Macron has been discussing, is Europe should be there to defend Europe. Now, they have the same goal, they have different reasons. President Trump is looking for probably more of a pivot towards Asia, and that the European Union has as a combined entity, has a bigger GDP than the United States, but the United States spends a lot more on defense than the European Union. Basically, a organization that is that rich. Again, the European Union does not have a military, but most of the European Union countries are in NATO. So there is definitely an overlap there in that Europe should be paying more for its national defense. So again, you got President Trump and President Macron coming up with the same idea of what they want, is that President Trump wants to spend less on European defense and have the ability to pivot to Western Asia or Western Pacific. You got President Macron, who wants to have Europeans responsible for their own defense and to reduce the influence of the U.S. in Europe. So they are both reaching the same goal for different reasons. Now, and President Macron, in his speech to at Cesson-Sévigné in Western France at the Army Digital Support Command School, Center, I'm sorry, not school, center, is he discussed the ideas that the Europeans need to take more reliance on their own defense. So to be able to do this, the war in Ukraine has to end, because Europe cannot spend the Europeans cannot replace U.S. defense spending on Ukraine. The U.S. has stated that they want the war to end, and the Europeans are looking at this opportunity of a new president in office, one that wants to take a different direction in the Ukraine war. Many of the pragmatic leaders, beyond the headlines, the clickbait headlines of Trump's going to the U.S. is going to leave NATO, the more pragmatic leaders are looking at this as an opportunity to seek an end to the Ukraine war. So now you're starting to see the ideas of coming from a proposal which was at one point, even in middle 2024, late 2024, could not be discussed, was the idea of a security for land type arrangement to try to end the war before, because Ukraine would not refuse to negotiate with the Russians, and they refused to give up any territory. Well, there's been a shift in the U.S. saying that if, and they're never promoted this, but if the West does not get involved in the war directly, there's no way the Ukrainians can take back the captured territory. And any type of policy that is based on that will basically put the war on a footing that it will never win until the Ukraine military collapses, just by sheer size of the Russian population over the Ukrainian population. At some point, the Ukrainians cannot maintain this war forever, especially if the political leadership of Russia is willing to continue to fight this war. So that the change in leadership and the call by the U.S. making the point that there has to be some type of land for security type arrangement. And President Zelensky of Ukraine did actually go to, I think he actually went to Mar-a-Lago after the election, and basically came out with an agreement that he supports the idea of the U.S. Strategy to try to end the war. He's not, I would not say that he's wholly on board, but can you really blame him from the point of view is that if you're a leader of a country, would you be happy that some other country gets to invade your territory, and the peace settlement that's being negotiated is they get to keep the land they took illegally from you? Okay, so I could see that he is a little salty about it, and I have no issues with him being publicly salty about that. But I think he's also embracing the ideas that this war cannot go on forever. And I think my belief is with the change in the U.S. administration, pragmatic leaders like Macron, which I'm not a big fan of, but he has not gone into the fear mongering of many European leaders. The Germans are hard to measure because they have an election coming up in February. Whoever's trying to take over, they're still trying to stake their political ground and not try to create a position of showing being pro-U.S., which President Trump is, from the European population perspective, very unpopular. So that politicians in Germany don't want to take a position where they seem like they're favoring President Trump's position, but also they're looking at a point is that there is war fatigue in Germany over this never-ending support for Ukraine. So they're trying to shift a balance in there. So I can't say that Germany's not being pragmatic. They are playing local politics to determine who's going to be the next chancellor of Germany. So, but you're seeing pragmatic leaders in Poland, in the Baltic countries of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and other countries like Hungary start to be a little bit more supportive of the idea of ending the war through some type of peace through security arrangement. Now, for this to happen, first off, we'll go in there, is that this would not be possible without the U.S. election. And the Russians are even, I think that my belief is the Russians are also looking for an off-ramp because they have never been offered an off-ramp to end the war. Not saying they deserved it, but with this continuing sense of escalation, that was the only way forward was for the West to keep escalating, the Russians to keep laying red lines. When the West crosses those red lines, it causes counter reaction from the Russians to continue to destabilize areas of the region. But nobody had a way to try to seek a way forward to end the war. Now the paradigm shift has come with the election of President Trump. It's allowing previous taboo subjects to start being discussed from Kyiv all the way through Berlin, Paris, and London, where all of a sudden they're talking about the ability to negotiate an end to the war. Now, the Russians haven't agreed to it. There's a lot of things that still have to happen. But President Macron, I said earlier, is that his argument is that the Europeans need to allow the U.S. the latitude to do what is needed to bring the Russians to the bargaining table, and that the Europeans are going to be responsible negotiating with the Ukrainians. Macron makes the point that the Europeans are not going to negotiate on behalf of the Ukrainians, but they have a role to play to provide security to Ukraine. So, and security is what the Ukrainians have been wanting for the longest time. And they're talking about doing this in a way that doesn't include NATO membership, which is also a non-starter to the Russian position. So now you're starting to have discussion as the idea is, okay, how can the Europeans provide security? That the U.S. has to have the latitude to get the Russians to come to the peace tables for serious negotiations, and that countries like France, the UK, Germany, Poland are going to need to provide peacekeepers inside Ukraine as a buffer zone. Also, Macron is looking from the point of view is that even if Ukraine doesn't become a member of NATO, which is again a red line, or it doesn't become a member of European Union, which the Russians say is a red line, but I've argued at some point there has to be Ukraine will probably have to become a member of the European Union, and I hope that the European Union will be able to enforce standards on Ukraine to cut down on the corruption, or I can't say eliminate, but reduce the corruption in that country that existed prior to the start of the war. I think Ukraine was considered the most corrupt country in Europe. Not saying that about the people, I'm talking about the government, not the people. So that the European Union, as they started providing prior to the war, as the Europeans were providing economic assistance to the Ukrainians had to meet certain anti-corruption measures as a condition to that aid, for that aid and that aid to continue. You suspect that will continue after post-war. So now you got the ability where they're talking about the idea of Europeans providing security, because President Trump and his lead retired U.S. Army General Keith Kellogg, who's going to try to negotiate a peace settlement on behalf of the U.S. on the U.S.'s blueprint for peace, is the idea is that the U.S. would provide additional weapons to the Ukrainians, but to Macron's point is that he wants to create a European defense industry that is separate of the United States. Basically, the idea is that the Europeans should eventually get to the point that it stops buying U.S. weapons and produces its own weapons. So part of the economic development of Ukraine to help them rebuild their country is to build a defense industry inside Ukraine. This will give the ability to the Ukrainians to make more advanced weapons for themselves, including ammunition. Artillery ammunition has been a major problem for the Ukrainians. So you expect that a lot of ammunition production would be made in Ukraine. And the Europeans would buy from that Ukraine defense industry, basically giving an economic assistance to Ukraine as they become, I don't want to say quite they're going to be the arsenal of Europe as Macron sees it, but it would add a industry to Ukraine in the ability to help the country create some long-term economic benefit, as the Europeans are, in Macron's vision, is to take responsibility of their own defense, which means more defense spending, which means you have to buy more. If you want to sit there, and this is what's happening a lot in defense spending, is that as more and more money is being poured in to try to purchase weapons, but the capacity to produce the weapons lags behind the demand for weapons, the price goes up. You make Ukraine an active, working defense industry that increases the supply, which will have downward pressure on the cost of defense goods. And again, it provides an industry to the Ukrainians to create a more stable society, help them rebuild. It can be used also for loans and grants to help rebuild the country. So Macron needs to convince European leaders to commit a substantial number of peacekeepers and for an extended period of time to act as a deterrent, to provide the security that the Russians need. Now, the Europeans have talked about the idea of roughly 50,000 peacekeepers. The Ukrainians have come out, President Zelensky came out with some number which seems arbitrary, is 200,000 peacekeepers. And these have to come from European nations. Now, when you go into the combined land forces of Germany, France, Poland, that they only have 400,000 land forces. And the Ukrainians want 200,000 in their country. Now, these would be on a rotating basis. Also, many of these countries, Germany specifically, are in no fit state to be able to provide large number of forces. It's certainly not to the point that each force, let's say each country, France, Poland, Germany, and the United Kingdom, would have to provide 50,000 troops apiece. Well, for example, the United Kingdom only has 74,000 people or 74,000 soldiers in the British Army, and they're supposed to provide 50,000, and they're supposed to be able to rotate out. This is a number that's beyond what the British Army could support. The Bundeswehr struggles to man a new armored brigade in Lithuania, and the Lithuanians are paying a large part of being able to put the force there, and the Bundeswehr, German army, is struggling to be able to meet that commitment. So it's highly doubtful that 200,000 could be met. It's also doubtful that the Russians would allow a large force of 200,000 Western soldiers to be in the along their border, when one of the stated reasons, is they wanted to keep the Ukraine from becoming part of NATO or becoming a client state of the West, and Europe in particular, United States as well. And the fact that you put 200,000 soldiers from NATO countries on their border, that's probably not going to be accepted by the Russians. It's going to be basically a killer. So why President Zelensky came up with this number is beyond me. A force of 50,000 seems relatively reasonable, because unfortunately, that would be enough not to threaten Russia, but it would also be enough to be a deterrent, because if Russia finds some way to attack these troops, whether creating casualties or whether capturing them, that would be a casus belli. It would be a reason for Europe to go to war over Ukraine, and the U.S. would most likely get involved, even though they wouldn't be in the peacekeeping region. My point is, even though the U.S. wants Europe to pay more for its own defense, Europe is still in the vital interest of the United States, and they would not allow. They would most likely get involved in some type of war, and the Russians know it. So that is deterrence. Now, I don't know why Zelensky came up with this 200,000. It seems very arbitrary, unless he's trying to find some way to derail these peace talks or make more demands on the West that, he'll lower the numbers if they give him something in return. That's all part of the negotiation process. So the point is that this war needs to end if President Macron wants to get the U.S. out of European security matters, or the U.S. not to be the most powerful member of European defense matters and making decisions for European security. Basically, the U.S. makes all decisions of European security. Macron wants that at end, and it seems like President Trump wants less involvement in European affairs, certainly not the costly part of it. So it seems like in this case, you're actually seeing alignment between President Trump and President Macron, both in the view that a way to end the war, President Macron is embracing the U.S. format to end the war, and the end result of reducing U.S. involvement in European security affairs. So it's kind of where both sides are aligning. Macron's tough part is trying to convince other European leaders of what the French are trying to attempt. Are they willing to follow the French lead? That's the questions that are still open for debate. So that's it for this week. Again, it'll be interesting to see what's in Europe. It's interesting to see that President Macron and President Trump are very aligned on both ending the Ukraine war, how to end the Ukraine war, and then how a post-Ukraine war Europe looks like. Never would have thought that. Again, challenge for President Macron is trying to convince other European leaders to go along with the French vision. Might be a little harder. And it will also be, eventually, it has to be something that will have to be assumed by President Macron's eventual replacement. Macron has had some tough issues trying to maintain his political support. Obviously, he's got a collapsed government that still needs to that issue needs to be still addressed. And again, what will happen? But again, this is a vision of President Macron. Is just trying to convince other Europeans to go along. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. We'll certainly talk more about it. I think that there will be lots to discuss about the progress of Ukrainian peace talks and ending the war. All right, so that's it for this week. Thank you for all my new listeners. Thank you. If you're not a subscriber or a follower, please do that. Also, I'm a relatively low cost, low overhead type operation. But if you could see to provide one-time support through Patreon, buy me a coffee or Ko-Fi, all those links will be in the description, or become a paid subscriber to Substack. That would be greatly appreciated, as more and more papers that I want to get involved with do require paid subscriptions. Also, the idea is to get through the algorithm. They say it's not part of Substack, but obviously they provided somebody, I can't remember who it was, provided a view of the most influential and paid subscribers on Substack, and they all had very large followings. So that's definitely something that gets you up the algorithm, gets you more views, more clicks. I won't talk about some of the other things because there's definitely some disturbing trends in what it takes to get onto the top of Substack. Definitely helps to have be already a well-established personality type. That always helps. But there were some other disturbing trends on it. But anyway, I'm not getting into that. Substack is probably still one of the fairest areas to operate on, so I won't criticize that. I'm thankful for that. But if you could become a member or a subscriber or follower, that would be most helpful. And again, if you could see even one-time payments as little as $1 through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, or Ko-Fi, that would be also most welcome. All right, so all of you have a great week. I apologize for any type of audio issues I have with this. I guess that's something else I have to talk about. I just talked about low-cost operation. I might need to consider, this is the second major issue I've had with this soundboard, so I might have to consider some other options. So anyway, thank you. I hope all of you have a great week, and thank you for listening. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to reach out to me on Substack. I respond to just about every question come to me. I find that Substack is also, you see just definitely much more thoughtful discussions and desires to have discussions, not like trolls like you see on YouTube, lesser extent Rumble, and then a lot on Twitter or X. So all of you have a great week. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.